Like and follow if you love horror. The cops weren't even forgiving when Patty, George, and Bronson were required to identify the remains of Warren's body. They wanted to know what happened to the head, but finally the questions caused George to snap. His mind sprung from a numb void as he lashed out at each officer individually. It was the idea of it. His friend had just died, gruesomely, right in front of him. The cops finally retreated with what information they had. Afterwards, there was hardly a word spoken between the three. Everyone felt like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag, as George was fond of saying. But questions weren't completely over. The sheriff eventually arrived, and he too had questions. "So you were attacked?" Sheriff Clintock grilled George for the second time in one day. "Yeah, attacked." George just about shot his bolt, but even worse, he still wasn't sure if he could trust the sheriff. "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" the sheriff asked, insultingly hearkening back to his last conversation. "Could a bear do that?" He motioned to the room that held Warren's body. "A bear could rip off a man's head, but not so cleanly. Let me fucking tell you something. I'm not sure of what I saw up there, but I know it weren't no damn bear, and I know nothing like that goes around a small town like yours unnoticed. It took my friend's head completely off." "Alright, easy does it. Now I know you're upset, but don't think I won't slap a pair of cuffs on a man just because he's lost a friend." The sheriff puffed at his chest. "Oh no, there ain't no easy does it. I know about the missing people. What's the population out here during the winter time? Does it even break 70? So are you really dumb enough to think that's normal, or are you just pretending?" The sheriff placed his hands on his hips and nodded sharply, looking very much like he might try to sucker punch George. "We have suspects for each and every one of those missing persons." The sheriff looked down the hall at the state troopers who lingered. "Don't go far. I'm not finished with you, not by a long shot." "Yeah? The way I see it, it's the state's jurisdiction now." George now puffed out his chest just to see how the sheriff would respond. They glared tensely at each other. "I'm not listening to another minute of this." The sheriff slapped his notebook shut and stormed off. George just shook his head and sat back down. Patty and Bronson moved closer to him so they could talk quietly. "I'm sorry, guys," George said, a bit hoarse from the exhaustion. "You didn't do it. Don't apologize." Patty's tone was almost cold and clinical. "Didn't I?" George asked. "By inviting that little prick into our cabin?" "They're not they're not fucking vampires, George," Bronson added. "Least I don't think. What I mean is, we're up there alone. They'd have found us anyway." "So what now?" Patty whispered. "Did anyone hit one?" George asked flatly. "One what? What were we even shooting at? Did anyone see a body when the cops burst in?" Patty added, a hint of ire in her words. "There were..." George shook his head, struggling to find anything intelligible about his memories from the shootout. "All I can remember are these glassy orbs. There was like a cluster of them, kind of like spider's eyes, but all in a bundle together." "That thing in Warren's head." Patty couldn't find the words, but simply repulsed from the memory. She went cold. It hollowed out his fucking head like a goddamn hermit crab. And yeah, it had a cluster of shiny black eyes. "So what? It's like a parasite?" Bronson didn't get a clear look as everyone else did. "The ones outside were a lot fucking bigger than the one in Warren's head." George felt nauseous. "So it must have been, I don't know, a baby?" "A baby fucking what?" Bronson did his best to bite on every word, not wanting to attract attention. "It doesn't matter. Once we get out of here, we head for Kodiak Lake and straight to the town hall," George suggested, pounding his fist into his other hand. "I say we warn as many people as possible and get a posse together." "Goddamn right," Patty agreed, that look of ire lingering in her eyes. Bronson nodded. The four were now three, and there seemed no time for mourning. However, it was still night, and they were in no condition to travel. First and foremost, they needed the hospital to discharge George and Patty for the minor scrapes and cuts they received from broken glass. Second, traveling at night with whatever was out there just seemed like a bad idea. They couldn't be sure how many they killed, if any at all, so they had to assume there was no less a threat now than before. Given their constraints, they chose to get some much-needed rest. The hospital agreed to give them a private room and beds for all three of them, even though Patty and George were the only two patients. Between their nerves and the uncomfortable beds, they didn't get much sleep. Eventually, they did nod off, and Patty stirred at about 5 a.m. She was sore and really didn't want to be awake. She nudged George, then Bronson. "I swear to fucking Christ, if I could just get a full night's sleep." George tried to wipe the grogginess from his face. It's been difficult to convince the It had been difficult enough to convince the hospital to give them a private room. Convincing them to allow their discharge was the next trick. That required one of George's famous rants to get the hospital to comply. He bitched about premiums, the cost of care, and some damn conspiracy in which the government takes Joe Smuckatelli for a ride, as he was fond of saying. That got them out, but this left them with a more interesting problem. They had choppered in. They couldn't just chopper back, and they were 50 miles from the cabin. They had money, but were still in their long johns with nothing more than parkas over that. There weren't exactly taxis or Ubers out in the upper Adirondacks. That meant hitching a ride with the first large truck that would bother. Excuse me. Thankfully, plenty of logging trucks still came through the area. By the time they got to the town hall on Kodiak Lake, it was almost 2, and the clerk was out to lunch. This time of year, it was amazing they even had a clerk at all. But Gershwin Kroner of the Historical Society had made this place his home for 48 years, and he was spry for a man in his 60s. He was also stubborn as a deer tick and grumpy as a badger. George had a couple brushes with him over the years, none of which were neighborly, and neither were very fond of each other. It was over an hour later when Gershwin returned. He shot George a sour look and refused to talk to anyone but Patty. How would one go about calling an emergency town meeting? Patty remained pleasant but firm. She wanted Gershwin to know the situation was dire. "Well, we have an emergency broadcast system in case of disaster. What we do is we call in volunteers in the sheriff's department. Then they go about with a loudspeaker calling everyone back here. Hasn't been done since, 1973, Gershwin explained, seeming unsure of what they wanted exactly. "Is there any way we could do that without contacting the sheriff's department?" Patty asked bluntly. Gershwin shot George another look. George grimaced, realizing they might be dependent on a man who he could only describe as abrasive at best and acrimonious at worst. Gershwin seemed to like Patty, though. "Now, why in the world would we want to call an emergency meeting and not including law enforcement?" Gershwin said, a confrontational tone rearing its ugly head. "Look, this is the kind of emergency that we want the townspeople to know about, but really shouldn't bother the sheriff's department unless it's official business. Agreed?" Patty tried to sweeten her tone, but she unintentionally came off as condescending. "An emergency that isn't important enough to warrant official business for the sheriff's department." Gershwin was flat out condescending. George bit his tongue as much as he wanted to bite the arrogant bastard's head off. Patty, almost as if she could tell George was radiating anger, stroked the back of his hand and smiled. She turned to Gershwin, still smiling. "Gershwin, dear, I've had a really rough night. I barely got any sleep, and I'm not in the mood for debate. Now you're either going to call an emergency meeting, or I'm going to have these two nice gents behind me rip your fucking arms off." Patty didn't break eye contact, nor did she stop smiling. George and Bronson both winked at Gershwin, almost in unison. Gershwin backed away from the counter and pointed at the local CB, trying to force a smile.